Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. Yeah, I know I've got a red spot on my chin. I tripped and fell. We are still making our way through line 5. We are now on chapter 5, which, Speak No Evil, talks about how abortion practitioners amongst themselves behave in ways that are highly unseemly. We covered the National Abortion Federation and Planned Parenthood. Now we're kind of looking in general, and it's an area that Crutcher calls the dark legacy. So he points out something I've been pointing out on my blog and channel, which is that for the abortion lobby, legal is absolutely non-negotiable. Safety, on the other hand, seems to be totally optional. And we start with the story of what I've since dubbed the Compton-Carr Effect. So in 1989, an investigation by the Miami Herald revealed that Dadeland Family Planning was reusing disposable instruments. Doctors were leaving the facility while patients were still in recovery. There were no nurses on staff. Patient recovery was monitored by employees with no formal health care training. The stirrups on the procedure table were covered in blood. The oxygen mask had lipstick from the previous patient, and abortions were being sold to women who only believed themselves to be pregnant. And then there was, of course, the case of Ellen Williams, a dying woman who was offered little more than tea and sympathy to treat her raging peritonitis. So these were not wonderful people. However, in response, instead of working to make abortion safer, abortion practitioners banded together to make themselves safer. They formed what they called the Florida Abortion Council, which is since defunct. Evidently, they got their wishes. The Florida Abortion Council led the fight to halt any state oversight of abortion facilities in the wake of the Dadeland scandal. Janice Compton-Carr, who was head of the council, summed it all up in a quote in the Miami Herald. "In my gut, I am completely aghast at what goes on at that place, but I staunchly oppose anything that would correct this situation in law." And then we move forward to looking at instillation abortions, especially those using hypertonic saline, which is a very strong solution, sterile salt solution. It was invented in 1939 by a Romanian abortionist named Eugen Abruel. He first got the idea of taking out amniotic fluid and replacing it with something that would either kill the fetus, induce premature labor, or do both. So different substances were tried with varying degrees of success, varying complications. The hypertonic saline became the most popular. So they spread into many nations where abortion was legal, and saline became the preferred abortifacient. Now, they became particularly popular in Japan following World War II. But within the Japanese medical community, word spread rapidly that this method was unsatisfactory. Too many women were being injured and killed. Over 70 papers were published in the Japanese medical community reporting the hazards of saline abortions, including at least 60 maternal deaths. The Japanese Obstetrical and Gynecological Society condemned the technique, and it was quickly abandoned. But the Japanese doctors kind of kept it to themselves until they noticed that Western doctors discovered the instillation method and were embracing it with great enthusiasm. So two Japanese doctors, Takashi Wagatsuma and Yukio Manabe, broke the silence. Wagatsuma wrote, "It is, I think, worthwhile to report its rather disastrous consequences which we experienced in Japan." Manabe wrote, "It is now known that any solution placed within the uterus can be absorbed rather rapidly into the general circulation through the vascular system of the uterus and placenta. Thus, any solution used in the uterus for abortion must be absolutely safe, even if given by direct intravenous injection. A solution deadly to the fetus may be equally toxic and dangerous to the mother. In spite of the accumulating undesirable reports, the use of hypertonic saline for abortions is still advocated and used in the United States and Great Britain. I would like to call attention to the danger of the method and would predict further occurrences of death until this method is entirely forgotten in these countries." And as the technique gained popularity in the West, other grim reports rose. A British study published in 1966 found that the saline could enter the mother's bloodstream and cause brain damage. Swedish researchers noticed an unacceptably high rate of complications and death. Sweden and the Soviet Union abandoned saline abortions as too dangerous for women in the late 1960s. Then Crutcher notes what we believe to be the first saline abortion death in the United States. A 27-year-old California woman who suffered the very predictable cerebral edema and electrolyte imbalances that Manabe and Wakatsuma had warned about, and she died an agonizing death in a Sacramento hospital in 1965. And Crutcher goes on to note the continued saline deaths in spite of a few American doctors who were starting to catch on that the Japanese and the Soviets and the Swedes were right to abandon the technique. One doctor warned in the July 3rd, 1972 Journal of the American Medical Association, saline amniocentesis abortion has the highest fatality rate of any elective surgical procedure, second only to cardiac transplantation. The ethical, sensible answer to this problem would be to place a moratorium on saline abortions. Now, they were dangerous even when performed in a hospital. We can look at Carmen Rodriguez, Barbara, Twyla Coulter, Nancy, Natalie Myers, Gwendolyn Drummer, Wendy, Catherine Morse, and Roseanne, who, prior to Roe versus Wade, died of safe and legal saline abortions performed in hospitals. New York abortion doctors took this even further. They would do them on an outpatient basis, merely injecting the saline and then sending the woman home with no medical supervision. And the fact that this should come out as deadly is no surprise, with Anita, Vicky, Kimberly, April, and Beth dying that we know of. I have very little doubt that there are other women who had no paperwork from their abortions, went down to New York from New England, or came up from New Jersey or Pennsylvania, maybe traveled from Ohio, got the saline injection, went home, died, and nobody knew what had caused it. So, and now in 1973, the same year, the Supreme Court handed down Roe versus Wade and pretty much gave carte blanche to a cadre of doctors who had already proven themselves untrustworthy. An article in the February 1st, 1973 issue of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology noted a 50% complication rate with saline abortions. Women continued to die, including Beverly Agnes and Eleanor in 1973, Cheryl Tubbs and Sherry in 1975, Jacqueline Bailey in 1977, Elizabeth Suji in 78, Lynn McNair in 79, Angel Darty in 82, Christella Forte in 86, Melissa in 92, and Linda Boom in 1995. And then there was the unfortunate Shelby Moran, who was left incapacitated from a saline abortion in 1978 and lingered in a nursing home until her death in 1999. And you have to understand, again, these are just the deaths I have found out about it. I think you would be some kind of fool to think that I personally know about every abortion death that happens in the United States. There is no fatality fairy that leaves autopsy reports under my pillow. Okay? And Crutcher notes how telling it is that it's a live birth and not deaths like these that were dubbed the dreaded complication. Now, saline abortions slowly faded out of favor and were replaced by the D&E method of dismembering the fetus with forceps or with a quick lethal injection of digoxin. However, in a 1987 issue of their technical bulletin, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists described how to perform these abortions with only a tepid warning of the risks. Abortion guru Warren Hearn described how to perform these abortions in his 1991 edition of Abortion Practice. He compared the perceived benefits and drawbacks of various chemicals, but never mentioned the 3 countries that had absolutely abandoned the technique. And Dr. Don Sloan wrote a book for the layperson, Abortion, A Doctor's Perspective of Woman's Dilemma, in which he, I'll quote line 5, blandly describes a saline abortion as biochemically simple, sound, and effective. The fetus and placenta are destroyed, and nature then takes over with an expulsion by labor. He notes that this method carries A distinct advantage for the abortionist who doesn't have to be around when the fetus, macerated and lifeless, is expelled. He does admit that saline abortions are emotionally hard on the woman, but makes no mention whatsoever of the risk to her life, health, and bodily integrity. The line 5 goes on to say, the point is, to this day, 42 years after saline abortions were abandoned in Japan, 30 years after Wagatsuma and Manabe warned us of their terrible dangers, 22 years after an American Medical Association article called for a moratorium on saline abortions, and 14 years after the Centers for Disease Control finally recognized the technique was dangerous and should be abandoned, many U.S. abortionists have yet to acknowledge the dangers of instillation abortions. And I will note in closing that the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics published a web page in 2006 presenting the method as safe, and the 2020 CDC abortion surveillance summary notes that 189 instillation abortions were reported to them that year. They didn't break it down by what chemical was used, but clearly this technique has still not been abandoned.